In 1980, you could walk into a Chevrolet dealership, point at America's sports car, and drive home a Corvette with 180 horsepower. For men who remembered 427 big blocks and solid lifter cams, that number didn't just look small. It felt wrong. The Corvette had once been a symbol of American excess, compression, carburation, and cubic inches. By 1980, it was fighting emissions regulations, insurance pressure, and a changing market. Some said it had lost its edge. Some said it had lost its identity. The real question was this: had America's sports car lost its future? The peak and the fall. To understand 1980, you have to remember what Corvette once represented. In 1969, you could order a 427 rated at 435 horsepower. In 1970, the LS5 454 carried a 390 gross horsepower rating, and the LS6 went even further. These were engines built around compression, camshaft, and carburation. Acceleration felt immediate. Quarter-mile times were legitimate. The car delivered on the promise printed in the brochure. Then the numbers began to fall. By the mid-1970s, emissions regulations reshaped engine design. Compression ratios dropped into the 8s to accommodate unleaded fuel. Cam timing was softened for smoother combustion and cleaner exhaust. Catalytic converters restricted flow. Spark advance was dialed back. By 1980, the standard L48 350 produced 190 net horsepower. The optional L82 made 230. In California, buyers opened the hood to find a 305 cubic inch engine rated at 180 horsepower. That shift wasn't just mechanical, it was emotional. For enthusiasts who had grown up with big block torque and high compression small blocks, those numbers felt like surrender. When you first saw those 1980 ratings, did you see a temporary setback or the end of something bigger? Why it happened? The decline did not happen overnight, and it did not happen by accident. The Clean Air Act changed the landscape. Engines had to meet increasingly strict emission standards. High compression ratios, designed for leaded fuel, no longer worked with unleaded gasoline. Spark timing was retarded. Camshafts were softened. Exhaust systems were restricted. Catalytic converters reduced harmful emissions, but they also increased back pressure. At the same time, insurance companies targeted high-horsepower cars. Younger drivers faced steep premiums. Manufacturers understood that openly advertising massive output invited higher rates. Then came the switch from gross horsepower ratings to net horsepower. In 1972, gross figures were measured on an engine dyno, without accessories or exhaust restrictions. Net horsepower reflected the engine as installed in the car, with full exhaust, air cleaner, and accessories attached. Overnight, numbers dropped on paper. Fuel economy standards also played a role. Corporate average fuel economy requirements meant manufacturers had to balance performance with efficiency across their fleets. Corvette could not exist in isolation. The result was an engine that still looked like a small block Chevrolet, but behaved differently. Lower compression, smaller cams, conservative tuning. It wasn't incompetence, it was survival. The real question becomes, were engineers giving up on performance or protecting the car's future under political pressure? The 305 controversy. Nothing symbolized the 1980 struggle more than the California-only 305. For the first time since 1955, a Corvette left the factory with less than 350 cubic inches. The LG4 305 produced 180 net horsepower and 255 pound-feet of torque. It was installed solely to meet California emissions requirements. Mechanically, the difference between a 305 and a 350 was not catastrophic. The power gap was modest. On the street, the experience was not dramatically slower than the base L48. But symbolically, it mattered. Corvette had always stood for displacement, for cubic inches, for the idea that America solved performance problems with more engine. Seeing 305 under the hood felt like surrender, yet Chevrolet did not install it casually. It was a regulatory compromise, not an identity choice. Without that adjustment, Corvette risked losing access to the California market entirely. So here's the debate. Was the 305 truly the problem? Or was it simply the visible reminder of a decade already shaped by regulation? Because sometimes perception does more damage than the hardware itself. Was Corvette actually dying? Despite the criticism and the magazine headlines, the Corvette was not collapsing in 1980. Sales tell a different story. More than 40,000 units were produced that year, a strong figure for a two-seat American sports car and a tightening economy. Buyers were still signing papers. The loyalty base was still there. Corvette had not lost its audience. What had shifted was reputation. By 1980, European manufacturers were earning praise for balance, refinement, and handling precision. Porsche, in particular, had built a serious engineering image. The C3 Corvette platform, first introduced in 1968, was now more than a decade old. Its styling still turned heads, but underneath, critics pointed to aging aerodynamics and interior materials that felt dated. Even though the Corvette retained independent rear suspension, something many competitors did not, the overall package no longer felt cutting edge. But beneath the surface, change was already underway. GM engineers were deep into development of the C4 platform, wind tunnel work, structural rigidity improvements, revised suspension geometry, a sharper focus on chassis dynamics rather than just displacement. The disappointment of 1980 created urgency. It forced Chevrolet to reconsider what Corvette needed to represent in a regulated, efficiency-driven world. Was horsepower alone enough? Or did American performance need to evolve? Sometimes a product doesn't fade when it struggles. Sometimes it adapts because it must. The turning point, the early 1980s, marked a genuine reset for Corvette. Behind the scenes, Chevrolet engineers knew the C3 platform had reached its limits. The next generation, the C4, would not rely on nostalgia or cubic inches alone. It would focus on aerodynamics, reduced weight, and handling precision. Structural stiffness became a priority. Suspension geometry was modernized. The chassis was engineered to feel tight and responsive rather than simply powerful in a straight line. Fuel injection returned as a serious performance tool, not just an emissions necessity. Electronics were refined. Throttle response improved. The goal was balance. The transition was not dramatic at first. Horsepower did not suddenly jump back to late 1960s figures, but something more important began to change. Steering feel sharpened, cornering improved. The car felt engineered again, not merely adjusted to survive regulations. The difficulties of the late C3 era, especially 1980, forced Corvette to justify itself through technical progress rather than raw output. That pressure reshaped priorities. When the C4 arrived, it did not attempt to relive 1969. It aimed to compete in the modern world. And perhaps that struggle was necessary. Sometimes the bottom of a cycle becomes the starting point for reinvention. The 1980 Corvette did not end America's sports car, but it forced it to confront reality. Lower compression, smaller numbers, regulatory pressure, a controversial 305. On paper, it looked like decline. In hindsight, it looks like transition. Corvette survived because enthusiasts stayed loyal and because engineers refused to let it stagnate. So here is the final question. If you had the money in 1980, knowing what you know now, would you still have bought one? Next time, we look at the C4, the car that had to prove the struggle was worth it.